When I started getting into performance and I started getting into cycling, and I would read these books about training, there was one common theme that was always discussed, and it was this kind of cause and effect relationship between what you did in training and your adaptive response or your performance. There's this old legendary story of Milan of Croton, who was this Greek Olympian. He was known as the world's strongest man. And the way that Milan would train is that he would begin each season by lifting a small baby calf. And every day he would lift this calf. And as this calf grew, so did Milan's strength, until one day he was able to carry a full-grown cow. There is this relationship between that dose and response, that power output, or that quantifiable workload, and your feel or your response that can't necessarily be pulled apart. They're intertwined. So oftentimes there's this question: do you train by the actual measurement, by the power, or do you train by the feel, by the response? And I think the answer is that you're always doing both all of the time, depending upon what you're capable of measuring. Where science is so interesting and where there's real innovation is that we're always figuring out new ways to measure things, right? But the fact of the matter is we always still live in our own bodies. We're always still acutely aware of whether or not we are in pain or feel good or are struggling or having the best day of our life. You can't separate the two. If you're able to do a certain power output and feel good, well, that's a positive sign. If you're able to lift that cow and you feel like shit, well, maybe lifting a big cow just feels like shit. There was this workout that I was doing with Tejay van Garderen, and it was a time trial workout where he was going to do these repeats.
I go and it's this like slight drag uphill. It's like 2%, and it was a block headwind, and it just felt like I was creeping. I was mashing the gears, the cadence was low, and I was just laboring, and I was like, you know what, I'm digging myself a hole right now. Like I gotta call it.
Before the distance was accomplished, he just sat up and he let go. We were kind of like, ah, crap, he didn't hit the mark. He's, not feeling good, etc. I think he was pretty bummed about it as well.
Like, yeah, I'm just not feeling it. And then we go back, we analyze the file, and it was like, oh wow, I did 430 watts for 20 minutes. That's pretty good. But I felt like it's just slow because of all these other factors, but I'm actually going really good right now.
The epiphany was, well, maybe you were feeling so bad because you had never been in those power bands before, because you've never pushed yourself that hard before. And so what ends up happening is that there's a recalibration once you have that epiphany. Once you have that epiphany, you go out and you're able to deal with that pain, you're able to deal with that struggle and not give up. Bring that power output to a whole nother level, and then back and forth. There's always this battle between power and feel. The hope is ultimately that you become more intuitive, and on the flip side, we have better tools for measuring how we're performing. And I think those two things are ultimately married. They're in orbit with one another. You can't have one without the other. So I think that, when we're giving workouts, I'm asking riders to pay attention to both power and to feel. And so there is this kind of third line that they're actually paying attention to, which is, how are those two things relating to each other? Is how I feel normal for that power output?
Sometimes your body plays tricks on you, like you know what it feels like to ride a certain power, and in a race, if it doesn't feel good to ride that power, you think that something must be wrong, when really it's like, well, maybe it's just the race that's wearing on you.
It's kind of impossible to tell a rider, hey, I just want you to go off of power today. It's also kind of impossible to tell a rider, hey, I want you to just go off of feel today. I think it's when you marry the two that you ultimately get the best result. That being said, I think we like to mix it up, right? Because when you pay attention to one variable versus another variable and you break apart that whole into distinct parts, you begin to dissect and learn more about yourself as an athlete. These tools are ultimately ways to give athletes feedback. And I think the coach's job is ultimately a way to reflect to the athlete what they're actually doing, and to give them the most accurate and unbiased information as you can get. The power meter is super cool because it doesn't lie.
I mean, the power meter is a useful tool, but it can't be, it's not the gospel. If you're having to set pace on the front for a leader, the way Sky sets pace for Chris Froome, those guys will be looking at their power meters to make sure that they're setting an even pace. If you're forced to follow that pace, oftentimes you don't want to look at your power meter because you're just like, it doesn't matter what the power meter's saying, I just have to focus on the wheel in front of me.
You can look at our watts, we could tell you back off or pick it up if we need to, but I think if you just ride it, it'll do that automatically.
In a team time trial, you're focusing more on speed. So I try to listen more to my cadence and the gear that I'm in so that I'm not surging on the front. It's almost like this feeling of you have to absorb the wind and not try to slip through it, because a lot of times people in a team time trial, they get to the front and they think it's my turn to pull, and they just go super fast. That's what happens if they're focusing too much on power, because they'll be like, oh, I have to pull it this watt, but that watt might be just stringing the group in this accordion that's gonna be an overall net slower speed than if you focus on feel and cadence. In an individual time trial, you're gonna ride very much to power. You could be cooking in the first part, but if you're gonna overpace it, you're gonna pay for that in the second half.
The thing about power output is that it is something that we are measuring. It's something that is kind of happening after the fact. What drives that power output, that sometimes is actually way more interesting. And so much of what drives that is either the heat of a race or emotionality. It's not something that I don't think we necessarily logically think ourselves into doing. We could be on a workout and say, hey, I need to hold 250 watts or 300 watts, and we can have the mindset to rationally do that. But the best performances happen in a different place. A good example of this is Tejay in the 2018 Tour of California time trial.
I went from Tour Romandy to a training camp in the Pyrenees, a training camp before California, and I was racing Tour of California. So it had been a while since I had seen my wife and girls. And I was sitting in the start tent, kind of like going through my head, okay, this corner, I had gone over in recon. And then all of a sudden I hear this, Dada, Dada, and I knew that voice, I could recognize that voice anywhere. It was Rylan. And I just like had a lump in my throat. I was so happy that they came. I was so surprised to see them. And I was just like, I have 40 seconds until I have to start. I have to go. I got to go do my job now. And okay, back in the game, head back in the game.
He launched out of the start gate with so much kind of adrenaline and ferocity.
One of the best time trials I've ever ridden. Got the stage victory, got the yellow jersey. It was a cool day.
He realized intellectually, like, hey, I might be way off pace. I might be going way harder than I know I can handle. But every time he tried to bring that power output down, it ended up drifting back up until he had to kind of relent or give in to his own emotion. And it was giving into that emotion that ultimately led to a really great time trial victory for Tejay in the Tour of California.